All right, this is take two for me. I didn't have the audio on. So, what we're going through is the foot, made out of spheres. And it took me about 2.5 hours to do this. But for this, I sped it up 8 times the speed. So it's about a 20-minute video. So if you wanted to watch it, slow it down, you could do it half the speed, which I think would be fine. Um, 2.5 hours is me just trying to figure it out as I go along. Because I spend a majority of the time readjusting all the forms as I go and thinking about what I should do next. Because I'm trying to be very careful about only working with the amount of spheres that is needed. I don't want any extra spheres in this at all. So I'm building kind of a form to work from the arch of the foot. Did the bottom, the heel, the main forms of the bottom of the foot. It doesn't look like much. It's a slow start, but it's. I think you could see it's pretty easy to get to this place, and I think once you do that, it's just a little easier to go from there. Um, I used Burne Hogarth's drawings as I did with the hand, so that we'd have consistency. The hands and the feet would be consistent. They would look like they belong together, so that when you join them to a figure, they make sense together. His drawings online, what I could find, weren't very plentiful. I think if you have the actual book, there's more drawings to work from, and so I wasn't interested in working from the book. I wanted to work strictly from what I could find online. Uh, but it might not be a bad idea. I think I would recommend to you as a student to get the book and maybe go over it and work with it with this method. It's not critical, but there would be some extra drawings in there for you to work from. And so, Burne Hogarth's stuff is pretty idiosyncratic. In the last take, what I did was I mentioned a little bit of the history about his work and his relevance. And I'll just keep it brief. Um, Even back in the day, he had a couple. He had some peers that were comic strip artists back in the 40s, and a couple of his peers were more highly regarded by the younger group of artists than they were of Burne Hogarth. Um, so you get a lot of people in the industry that don't have a lot of nice things to say about Burne Hogarth. He passed away maybe 10 years ago. But the thing about it is he's more relevant than his peers. I mean, in terms of today, like his books are just as successful and popular today as they ever were. And I think people today would remember him more for his books. And if you went to an art department, you're bound to find some people that would know who he is and not know who his peers were. Um, so he's good for what he did with the anatomy books, but as far as an artist, a comic strip artist, yeah, his work was very stiff. It was not as dynamic as you'd think it was. As he lays things out, it didn't have the action, and his peers did. And one of the peers in question was Alex Raymond, who was highly revered, and comic book artists, enthusiasts do understand the difference. And Alex Raymond's artwork recently set a record for comic strip art. Sold for $250,000 or something like that. A single comic strip he did. So every artist has something different to offer, and Burne Hogarth's is his anatomy books, I guess. His anatomy books are not for beginners, as I've said before. They're for people who are more advanced, I'd say, in their studies and their learning of the figure, they're at a more advanced stage, because what he has is very complex. He doesn't simplify. I think the point for a lot of anatomy books for artists is that you simplify it for the student so that they can remember it and get a handle on it. And I don't think Burne Hogarth stuff is that like that at all. But it's pretty good for the advanced student, because there's a sense of design that is kind of inspiring to try to emulate, I think. I don't agree with everything he does, but it's just a reference. It was just a reference to use to do this. Um, it's an accessible reference for everybody. I thought it might be uh, a way to supplement some information for something that's accessible. Um, accessible. Uh, yeah, these double spheres for the knuckles I don't like. I'll switch them out eventually for single in this demo here. Um, but you can see in that drawing, it's kind of got a double form slightly, and maybe that I'm misinterpreting that wrong. But anyway, I switch it out so it doesn't matter. Like, that's a beautiful drawing. The toes are beautiful, the design of it, but how helpful that drawing actually is, I'm not certain it's helpful at all. Um, it's interesting how he's got the little toes, all the little toes look like just a small version of the big toe, which I don't think that's really quite the case in a lot of depictions of the foot, but it looks good. So I spent a lot of time readjusting. So here, what you see is the toes move away from the midline. If you put your feet together, and that line that's between the feet, you could consider that the midline. You have your toes kind of angle away from that line a little bit. The big toe just slightly, but the next three toes more. And then the little toe moves back in toward the midline, essentially. So that's something that you definitely would want to remember when you're thinking about the foot. So he doesn't work with the same shapes I do here. He's working with some weird, like, edged. His stuff looks like it's definitely CAD, made with some other CAD program. Looks mechanical. Um, we're just using spheres, which is definitely the way you'd want to work with as a sculptor anyway. Because when you're working with clay and wax, you're using pellets or little balls of clay, and you're applying it to the sculpture. So this is not too much different from that technique. But he works in a way that is also a lot of sculptors work, and that is planes. People like to cut things down, to use they plane things down. The, so they may start out with a solid block of form, and then they'll basically carve down the planes, which is the way it looks like his structures are, where they have edges. But to me, that's carving. It's not like modeling. Um, a lot of people like to carve in clay. I like the additive process where you're adding to it rather than removing. My feeling is that stonework is one direction, it's removing. I treat clay similarly, where it's the other direction, it's adding. But that's just when you're starting out. At some point, you just do whatever it takes to get the job done, really. So I spent a lot of time fussing on the toes. Um, I I always meant to go back to it a little bit more and change things up a little bit, but I didn't want to get lost in it that way. I came to the conclusion that I just want to do what I find mostly in his drawings and just go with that. And so that's what I did. So yeah, I don't disagree with the spheres the way I have them laid out. I think I would stay with that. Um, I think the second time I would do it, it would take me about a half hour to do what took me 2.5 hours. Just because it's kind of figured out. Now you're dealing with things like, is the height of that foot correct? Is the width of it correct? Of course, it could be lower, it could be wider. Everybody's foot's different, so I'm just trying to make sure I'm following with his drawings. Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned it this time around. I did the last time. So the sequence to do these is the skull. I should have said it at the beginning of the video so you didn't get lost. The skull, then the hands, then the feet, then the figure. So I've got tutorial that I did with the skull, and that's a real-time tutorial where I talk as I'm doing it, tell you what I'm doing. And so I think by the time you get to the feet, you've already gone through that enough with those others that you don't need that for this. You can just see what's going on. That was the point of that. So um, I think naturally people would want to start with the skull anyway. If you saw a choice, should I do a foot or should I do a skull? I think most people would know to start with the skull. And then the hands, of course, same thing. You do the hand before you do the feet, I would think. So hopefully that just plays out that way. Here I'm sculpting you can see in that drawing how that angles away from the foot to give it a dynamic, that gives it a dynamic angle. And these are the bones essentially I'm adding. Uh, and now it's the calf muscles that I'm starting to add as well to those bones. So what I have is, I didn't mention it, but the spheres for the ankles, you want to make sure that the inside ankle, the inner ankle, is up higher and more forward. And the outside ankle is lower and back more. So I'm just adding a form of the leg at the top of the foot that I'll cut off. But I just want to have something so that there's a context, so the foot will fit to the leg for the figure. So I want to have that, make sure that it's makes sense. rather than just kind of have a fragment of the foot that doesn't quite meet the figure. We don't know that it's going to fit the figure quite right, the leg. Um, yeah, it's a weird way to work. To me, it needs a mesh mixer to really make sense. Because a mesh mixer, when you can make it a solid mesh, a single mesh, that's when it really kind of makes sense. So you're laying things out in a really quick, easy method with the spheres. Then you can bring it together as a single mesh. And then from that point, you could refine the details if you want. So here I'm making the tendons for each of the toes. And it's a tricky way to make tendons, uh, but it's effective. You know, it doesn't. It's like his tendons. He's got them kind of like contoured. They're following the contours. They're not tight cables. They're more like noodles or string just draped over the form. And I think some of that might be true because of the way tendons are fitted to the foot with ligaments. Um, but they're like cables. They're pretty. If you extend if you extend your toes, um, those tendons are cable-like forms. So I think the end result shows that it works. And that's I added that form in there as well too, because that's where the tendons kind of bunch up a little bit more and fill in that space a little bit. So I'm trying to cut off that top part, but you got to make sure that it's solid. There can't be any holes in it as you're doing it. So I'm making sure that yeah, it fills in. So I'm testing out a couple things with the toes I had questions about. Just nitpicky stuff, nothing that made any difference. So putting the skin on by using the smooth tool, you smooth it out, and it kind of it moves it gets rid of the sharpness of details, so it looks more like a skin is wrapped over the form. And the smooth, it took me, a couple minutes to do the smooth, or a couple seconds, basically. Nothing's extravagant. Here I'm going through and I'm comparing to all the Burne Hogarth drawings just to see if it's working. I'd say mostly it does. So on this final, this is real time. I've slowed it, it's down to real time. So I'm importing a pair of feet just so you can see what they look like. If it looks believable as a pair of feet. So yeah, those tendons are pretty tight. Um, Maybe a little bit too much, but it works. I wouldn't question it. It's a pretty believable pair of feet there. Burne Hogarth style feet. You can see the gap between the big toe and the gap between the little toe. So the middle three toes kind of are really close uniformly together. So, all right, that's it.